Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into something that you might not be aware of, especially if you don't follow energy markets that closely.
Yeah.
But it's this practice that involves something called jungle juice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so jungle juice is a type of fuel, and we're going to be looking at the journey that it takes from European refineries all the way to the streets of Lagos, Nigeria.
Interesting.
And the main source that we're using for this is an investigative piece that was published just this week by Source Material,
Okay.
and it's called Jungle Juice: How Europe Dumps Its Toxic Fuel in Africa.
So, I mean, just from that title, it sounds like we're about to get into something pretty heavy.
Yeah, we are. It's a fascinating look into how this trade, while seemingly isolated, actually connects to a bunch of larger global systems,
Right.
and it raises some serious questions about, responsibility and consequences for sure.
For sure. Yeah. And it's a really well-researched piece that really gets into the nitty-gritty of how this all works.
Absolutely. And to really understand the impact, the article starts with a personal story.
Oh, okay.
It features a woman named Otonye Iruma,
Mm.
a former Olympic athlete who lives in Lagos.
Wow. An Olympian in Lagos. I would love to hear more about her story. What's she doing now?
Well, that's actually where the story takes kind of a sad turn. What's particularly poignant about her story is that she suffers from respiratory issues
Okay.
due to the severe air pollution in Lagos.
That makes sense. I mean, air pollution is a huge problem in a lot of major cities around the world.
Yeah, and Lagos is no exception.
Right.
It's often made worse by the diesel generators that people have to use when the power grid fails.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, if the power's out, people are going to find a way to keep the lights on.
Exactly.
Okay.
And unfortunately for Otonye, this isn't just a personal struggle. It's a really widespread issue in the city.
Yeah, I can imagine. That must be incredibly difficult to deal with on a daily basis, especially if you're already dealing with respiratory problems.
Absolutely. And, that detail about the generators, I thought that was really interesting because it really brings home how interconnected these issues are.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
It's not just about the fuel itself, but also the infrastructure that's in place, or in this case, lacking.
Right. The infrastructure is not able to keep up with the demand, and so people have to rely on these generators, which just contribute to the problem.
Exactly. And tragically, Otonye's story gets even more heartbreaking.
Oh.
Because, unfortunately, she lost her sister to a pulmonary embolism,
Oh, what?
which is a condition directly linked to air pollution.
That's awful. I mean, it really highlights the very real human cost of this problem. It's not just numbers on a page.
Right. It's people's lives.
Exactly.
Now, to understand how this all ties into the fuel trade, we need to take a step back and explain what exactly jungle juice is.
Okay, yeah. What is jungle juice?
So jungle juice is basically a term used to describe a blend of fuel that's too dirty for European markets because of its high sulfur content.
High sulfur content. Okay, so maybe we need to have a quick little science lesson here for our listeners. Why is sulfur such a big deal when it comes to fuel?
Yeah, for sure. So basically, sulfur, when it's burned, releases sulfur dioxide, which is a major air pollutant.
Okay.
And it contributes to all sorts of problems, respiratory problems, acid rain, and it even plays a role in climate change.
Wow, so this is some nasty stuff.
It is, and that's why European countries have these really strict regulations to try to limit the sulfur content in the fuel that's sold there.
Makes sense. They're trying to protect air quality and public health.
Exactly. So now the question is, if Europe doesn't want this fuel, what are they doing with it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, they can't just throw it away, right?
Well, they could, but that's not what's happening.
So what are they doing with it?
Well, instead of refining this fuel further to meet those stricter standards that they have in Europe, or even, properly disposing of it, these companies are choosing a different route. They're exporting it. And they're capitalizing on the fact that a lot of African nations like Nigeria don't have such stringent regulations on fuel quality.
So they're basically taking advantage of those regulatory differences to make a profit.
Yeah, basically. And their article actually traces the journey of this jungle juice from refineries in the UK.
Okay.
Places like Prax Phillips, 66, SR Oil,
I see.
all the way to a blending facility in Antwerp, Belgium.
Oh, wow. So it's like making a pit stop in Belgium before it goes to Africa.
Right. And this blending facility is pretty interesting. It's called C-Tank K700B.
C-Tank K700B.
Yeah.
Interesting name.
Yeah, and get this, part of it is owned by a Russian oligarch.
Wait, really? A
Yeah.
Russian oligarch? What's he doing in the fuel business?
It's actually kind of a mystery. The article doesn't go into a ton of detail about it.
That's a little suspicious.
Yeah, it is. It really caught my eye. I mean, it's like something out of a spy thriller, but with fuel instead of espionage.
Right. It makes you wonder what else is going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. But anyway, from these blending facilities, the jungle juice is sold to major commodity traders.
Okay, so this is where the big players come in.
Right. We're talking about Trafigura and Vitol, two of the world's largest commodity traders.
Yeah, I've heard of those names. They're involved in all sorts of commodity.
They are, and they basically purchase the jungle juice and arrange for it to be shipped to countries like Nigeria.
So they're the middlemen in all of this.
Yeah. And their argument when they've been questioned about, the ethics of all this,
Yeah.
their argument is that they're just responding to market demand.
So they're saying it's not their fault if a country requests a specific type of fuel. They're just fulfilling that request.
Exactly.
I mean, that's an interesting point, but I wonder if it's really that simple.
Yeah, I'm not so sure either. I mean, is it really ethical to profit from selling something that, is harmful,
You're right.
even if it technically meets the bare minimum legal requirements?
He's like a moral gray area at best.
Definitely. And that's one of the big questions that this whole investigation raises. Is it just a matter of supply and demand, or is there a greater responsibility to think about the implications of these actions?
Especially when you look at the potential consequences.
Right. And the article goes into a lot of detail about the impact this jungle juice has on a place like Lagos, with its already stressed infrastructure and its high population density.
Yeah. So what are some of the specific health risks that we're talking about?
Well, the article mentions a bunch of things. Increased rates of respiratory illnesses like asthma bronchitis,
Oh, yeah.
a higher risk of heart attacks and strokes,
Whoa.
and even a greater likelihood of developing certain types of cancer.
That's scary. It sounds like this fuel is having a really serious impact on people's health.
It is, and it doesn't stop there. There's also a possible link to premature births
Oh, no.
and other developmental issues.
Wow, that's awful. It really paints a picture of the health burden that this type of fuel places on a population.
It does. And remember, this is all happening against the backdrop of Lagos' already severe air pollution challenge.
Right. It's like adding fuel to the fire, quite literally.
Exactly. And what's particularly troubling is that while the jungle juice itself might be cheaper, the long-term costs in terms of healthcare and lost productivity are probably way higher.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if people are constantly getting sick and can't work, then the economy's going to suffer too.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
kind of like a false economy.
Right. You save money up front, but then you pay for it down the road in other ways.
So let's break down why this jungle juice is so much cheaper in the first place,
Okay.
because that's a big part of this whole equation.
Yeah. I mean, if it wasn't cheaper, then there wouldn't be such a demand for it.
Right. So basically, it comes down to a few factors. First, producing this lower grade fuel lets refineries maximize the output from each barrel of crude oil.
Okay, I see.
They can sell the higher grade, cleaner fuel in Europe for more money,
Right.
and then still find a market for the stuff that nobody in Europe really wants.
So it's like a two-tiered system with Europe getting the good stuff and other countries left with the scraps.
Yeah, basically. But that doesn't explain the entire cost difference.
Okay, so what's the other piece of the puzzle?
The other big factor is that refining this high sulfur fuel further to meet those European standards requires additional processing and investment in technology.
I see.
And that adds to the cost.
Right, so by exporting it as is, they avoid those expenses and boost their profit margin.
Exactly. So are we saying that European companies are basically putting profits ahead of people's health?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's important to recognize those economic incentives at play
Right.
and how they can sometimes overshadow ethical considerations.
It's a classic case of short-term gains potentially leading to long-term pain.
Absolutely.
Now, the article doesn't just leave us with a sense of doom and gloom.
Okay, good.
It also explores some of the attempts that are being made to tackle this issue.
Okay, so what are some of the things that are being done?
Well, there have been some efforts to try to curb the trade of jungle juice. Both the Netherlands and Belgium have actually introduced export bans on this high-sulfur fuel.
Really?
Yeah,
So they're trying to cut off the supply at its source?
exactly.
That seems like a positive step, but I imagine it's only part of the solution.
Right. It's like squeezing a balloon. The problem might just pop up somewhere else.
Yeah, that's true.
Plus, even if they reduce the supply, the demand for cheap fuel in these developing countries isn't going to just disappear.
Right. So what about Nigeria itself? Are they doing anything to address this issue on their end?
They are. Nigeria has actually taken some steps to improve their fuel standards. They recently implemented a stricter sulfur limit for imported fuel.
Oh, okay. So they're trying to raise the bar.
Yeah, it's 50 parts per million, which is a significant reduction from the previous levels.
That sounds promising. Does it mean things are actually starting to change in Lagos?
It's definitely a positive step, but there's a big hurdle.
What was that?
Enforcement. Making sure that all the fuel that's being imported actually meets this new standard is a huge challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine. There are probably a lot of loopholes and ways to get around the rules.
Exactly. And that's something that the article highlights. It's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts.
It sounds like a long road ahead before the air in Lagos is truly clean.
Yeah, it seems like there's a long way to go.
But at least they're moving in the right direction.
Right. And this investigation really reveals how intricate all of these connections are and the consequences involved.
It's fascinating how something that seems so simple, like fuel, can have such far-reaching impacts.
It really is. And we've only just scratched the surface.
There's so much more to unpack here.
Exactly. And we'll be delving deeper into all those complexities in the next part of our deep dive.
It really is fascinating, like all these seemingly isolated choices having ripple effects
Yeah.
across the globe.
It makes you think.
It's not just about the fuel itself, it's these interconnected systems. And where does the responsibility lie?
It does make you think about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
For sure. And this investigation really went deep. Like, they were not messing around. They actually dug into the records of that blending facility in Antwerp,
Oh, wow.
the C-Tank K700B,
Okay.
and analyzed over 1,000 shipments.
Wow, 1,000 shipments. That's a lot of data.
It is. And what they found is pretty revealing. Nearly 40% of the fuel coming into this facility originated in the UK,
Okay.
largely from those refineries we mentioned earlier.
Right, Prax and Phillips 66 and all those.
Yeah. And then over half of the shipments going out of this facility ended up in Africa,
Wow.
primarily Nigeria.
So basically they're taking this fuel from the UK, sending it to Belgium to get mixed up,
Mhm.
and then shipping it off to Africa.
Yeah, it almost feels like a shell game, like they're just moving this fuel around until it finds a market where they can sell it.
Yeah, it's a bit shady for sure.
Right.
It's important to note, though, that the investigation doesn't explicitly say that all the fuel going from the UK to Antwerp and then to Africa is this, like, high-sulfur jungle juice.
Right.
But the patterns that they uncovered, combined with, like, the testimony they got from industry insiders, it paints a pretty compelling picture.
Oh, for sure. Like, remember that former refinery worker who described seeing exports with sulfur levels 1,000 times higher than the legal limit in Europe?
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. That's crazy.
It's a shocking detail.
1,000 times higher. I mean, come on.
And to make matters worse, they also found that another ingredient being added to the mix at this facility is something called pygas.
Pygas. What in the world is pygas?
So pygas is a byproduct of the refining process,
Okay.
and it's high in benzene, which is a known carcinogen.
Oh, no. So they're mixing this carcinogenic stuff with the already dirty fuel.
Yeah, essentially, they're taking these leftover dirty components that can't be sold in Europe, blending it all together.
And shipping it off to countries with less stringent regulations.
Exactly. And this is where the role of those commodity traders, Trafigura and Vitol,
Right.
becomes so crucial. They're the ones facilitating this whole trade, buying up that blended fuel
Yeah.
and transporting it to the end market.
And like you mentioned before, their response to the investigation was basically that they're just complying with the regulations of the countries they're selling to.
Mm-hmm.
They even use that analogy, like if someone asks for water, you don't give them champagne.
Right.
It's like, yeah, that's a clever argument.
It is.
But it kind of avoids that larger ethical question.
Yeah.
Is it really okay to profit from selling something that, is harmful,
Right.
even if it technically meets those minimum legal requirements?
It's a tough one. I mean, is it really that different from selling cigarettes?
Right.
To someone who doesn't fully understand the health risks.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It might be legal, but is it ethical?
This deep dive really forces us to confront some of those uncomfortable questions
Yeah.
about corporate responsibility and the global trade of potentially harmful products.
For sure. But it's important to also acknowledge that African countries aren't just passively accepting this fuel.
Right.
Nigeria, for example, recently implemented a stricter sulfur limit.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier, 50 parts per million.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
So does that mean things are starting to improve in Lagos?
Well, it's a good start,
Mm-hmm.
but as the article points out, enforcement is a big hurdle.
Right.
Ensuring that all the imported fuel actually meets this new standard is a big challenge.
Yeah. It's like easier said than done, I imagine.
Exactly. And even if Nigeria cracks down on the import of jungle juice, the demand for cheap fuel isn't going to just disappear overnight.
Right. That's the other side of this whole equation.
And that brings us to a crucial point.
Uh-huh.
This isn't just an African problem,
Mm-hmm.
it's a global problem.
Mm-hmm.
As long as there are economic incentives to produce and export this dirty fuel, the cycle is going to continue.
Yeah.
Which is why the article explores a couple of potential solutions
Okay.
that go beyond just those national regulations.
Let's dive into those. What kind of solutions are we talking about?
So one solution that they propose is stricter regulations at the source.
Okay.
If European countries just completely banned the export of this high-sulfur fuel,
Mm-hmm.
it would cut off the supply at its root.
That makes sense. But wouldn't those refineries just find other loopholes or other dumping grounds?
It's possible,
Yeah.
which is why another solution that they propose is a global agreement
Okay.
to phase out the production and use of high-sulfur fuel entirely.
Okay. So like a worldwide ban.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
It would require international cooperation
Mm-hmm.
and a commitment to really prioritize those environmental and health concerns over the short-term economic gains.
That sounds like a tall order. Getting all the countries in the world to agree on something like that, especially when you've got those economic interests at stake.
It definitely wouldn't be easy, but I think this investigation really shows how high the stakes are.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the health and well-being of millions of people. And the environmental damage from burning this fuel has far-reaching consequences.
Yeah. It's not just a local issue, it's a global issue.
It is. And it's a powerful reminder that our choices as consumers and as citizens can have a real impact even on that global scale.
Mm-hmm.
We can't just pretend these issues don't exist or that they don't affect us.
Right. We have to be informed, engaged, and willing to advocate for change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this whole investigation is a call to action. It's time to start asking those tough questions
Mm-hmm.
and demanding better solutions.
It's also a reminder that even these complex global systems can be understood
Yeah,
if you're willing to dig a little deeper, which is exactly what this deep dive is all about.
exactly. It's about empowering you, the listener, with the knowledge to make informed decisions
Mm-hmm.
and advocate for a better future. Because at the end of the day, we're all interconnected.
Right.
What happens in Lagos, what happens in Antwerp, what happens in those UK refineries, it all has an impact far and wide.
So as we move into the final part of this deep dive, it's important to remember that it's not all doom and gloom.
Right.
While the challenges are significant, there are people working to address them.
Yeah.
And there are things each of us can do to be part of the solution. Yeah, it can feel overwhelming to even think about these kinds of problems. But I think it's important to remember that we're not powerless.
Right.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
And we've learned a lot in this deep dive. We now understand, how this fuel is produced, who's trading it,
Right.
and the real impact it's having on people and
Yeah.
in the environment.
And the article does a good job of highlighting some of the individuals who are pushing back against this system.
Oh, yeah.
Like Utonye Rima, whose story we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
She's a really powerful advocate for clean air in Lagos.
It's inspiring to see people like her taking action.
It is, yeah. And it really shows that even one person can make a difference.
Absolutely. And it's not just about those individual actions either.
Right.
There are organizations that are dedicated to tackling this issue too.
Yeah, like the article mentions Public Eye.
Oh, right.
It's Swiss Campaign Group.
Okay.
And they've been investigating this trade of dirty fuels for years.
Wow.
They're actively pushing for stricter regulations and holding those corporations accountable.
That's good to hear. And, the fact that both the Netherlands and Belgium have taken steps to ban these exports
Yeah.
shows that progress is possible.
Yeah, it's definitely a step in the right direction, but like we said earlier, a truly effective solution will probably require much broader international cooperation.
Yeah, for sure. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
what are some things our listeners can do, right now, to be part of the solution?
Well, one way to make a difference is to support organizations like Public Eye
Okay.
that are working to create change on a larger scale. Even just a small donation
Right.
can help them continue their investigations and their advocacy efforts.
That's a great suggestion. And we'll be sure to include a link to their website in the show notes
Perfect.
for anyone who wants to learn more.
Another powerful way to make an impact is through our choices as consumers.
Okay.
Supporting businesses that prioritize ethical and sustainable practices
Right.
really sends a clear message to the market.
Mm-hmm.
It's about putting our money where our values are.
Right. Voting with our wallets. And we can't forget the power of just raising awareness.
Yeah,
Talking about these issues with friends, family on social media
for sure.
can help amplify those voices and put pressure on those in power to make real change.
Yeah, because this deep dive has provided a glimpse into this complex and often hidden system,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also shown us that there are people fighting back and that there are steps we can all take to join that fight.
We started this conversation with a question about responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think that's the question we want to leave you with today. What role do you want to play in creating a more just and sustainable world?
Yeah, it's a question worth thinking about because even those small choices, when they're multiplied across a community, have the power to shape the future.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and
Yeah.
maybe even a little bit inspiring. We'll be back next week with another fascinating topic. So be sure to subscribe and stay tuned.